The divorce papers were still warm in her hands when Emily Carter felt for the first time that her life was finally beginning. She had traded a quiet man with a second-hand car for a penthouse view and a name that opened doors, and told herself that was called ambition. Richard Hayes had everything she had spent 30 years pressing her face against the glass to see: money that didn't apologize, power that didn't explain itself, a world where people stood when you entered the room rather than simply making space. Next to him, her husband had always seemed invisible, steady, ordinary. What she didn't understand, not yet, was the difference between a man who displays his power and a man who simply holds it. Daniel had never needed anyone to know. That was the part she had never thought to ask about. Emily Carter had learned early that the world was divided into two kinds of people: those who were looked at and those who were looked past. She had spent most of her life in the second category. She grew up in Fresno, in a house where the carpet was always slightly damp and the refrigerator hummed too loud. Her mother worked double shifts at a garment factory, coming home with chalk-white fingers and a smile that had given up trying to reach her eyes. Her father had left before Emily was old enough to remember his voice, only the shape of his absence. The empty chair at dinner, the half of the closet her mother never touched. As a child, Emily used to press her nose against the windows of nicer houses during evening walks, not out of envy exactly, but out of a hunger she couldn't name. She wanted to know what it felt like to live inside a life where things were chosen, not merely endured. She got her scholarship. She got her degree. She got the job at Nexus Corp and the small house in the suburbs of Sacramento, with the 3 bedrooms and the backyard that needed reseeding every spring. She got Daniel, and for a while she told herself that was enough. Daniel Carter was the kind of man who moved through life without friction. He wasn't loud, wasn't flashy, didn't fill a room the way some men did with cologne and volume, and the particular confidence of someone who needed to be noticed. He was an engineer, or so he said, though Emily had never been entirely clear on what his work actually involved. He left early and came home at reasonable hours. He remembered how she liked her coffee. He fixed things around the house before she had to ask. He was good. Genuinely, quietly good. And somewhere along the way, Emily had started to confuse goodness with smallness. She had told him about Fresno once early in their marriage, in the way you tell someone something you don't fully want them to know briefly, without looking at them in the dark after the lights were out. He had listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he had simply put his hand over hers on top of the blanket and left it there. She had found that response unsatisfying at the time. She had wanted him to say something to fix it, or reframe it, or make it mean less. She didn't understand yet that some people show up by staying still. There were other things about him she noticed, but never examined. The late-night calls, for instance, 2 or 3 times a month, he would step out onto the back porch and speak in a low, unhurried voice for 20 minutes, sometimes 30. Not the voice of a man receiving instructions, something more deliberate, more final. She assumed it was a colleague. She never asked. On the kitchen counter, he kept a rotating stack of reading material, the Financial Times, the Harvard Business Review, a quarterly publication from some investment firm whose name she didn't recognize. She assumed he read them the way some people watch documentaries, for the feeling of being informed, not the information itself. Once early in their marriage, she had found 3 suits in the back of his closet. Charcoal gray navy and a deep black, each one cut with the kind of precision that didn't come off a rack. When she asked, he told her they were from a conference. Old gifts. He smiled when he said it, and she moved on, and the suits stayed in the back of the closet. The only time she ever asked him directly about money, they were sitting on the back porch after dinner, watching the sprinklers make slow arcs across the lawn. "Do you ever worry," she said, "about the future, about whether we're—" She gestured vaguely at everything around her. "Whether this is going to be enough." Daniel looked at the lawn for a moment. "I don't worry about that." "No. Why not?" "Because we have enough," he said. More than enough. She heard evasion. She didn't hear the answer. The transfer came on a Thursday afternoon, delivered in a brief email from HR, effective. The following Monday, Emily would be reassigned to the executive floor as a senior administrative liaison to the regional CEO. She had to read the title twice. Richard Hayes occupied the 32nd floor, the way certain men occupy any space completely, as if the architecture had been designed around him, specifically. He was 45 silver at the temples, with the kind of posture that comes not from effort, but from a lifetime of never being told to sit down. His office looked out over the city on 3 sides. His car, a deep green Bentley, sat in its own reserved space in the underground garage, and Emily had noticed on her first morning that the security guard nodded to it before Richard had even stepped out. He noticed her on the second day, not in the way that made her uncomfortable at first. It was subtler than that. He started asking her opinion in meetings which no one had done before. He introduced her to clients by name instead of title. He invited her to sit in on a conference call with investors from the East Coast, and afterward in the corridor told her that her instincts were sharp and that she was wasted in her current role. Nobody had ever said that to her. She knew intellectually that Richard Hayes was a man who had learned to make people feel chosen because it was useful. She knew this the way she knew that branded handbags were just leather with better stitching. Knowing something she had discovered offered very little protection against wanting it anyway. The first dinner invitation came 3 weeks after her transfer. He named a restaurant she had walked past many times without going in, because a single glass of wine cost what she used to budget for an entire Friday night. He arrived 40 minutes late, sliding into the chair across from her without apology, signaling the waiter as if he had been there all along. Emily told herself that powerful people operated on different schedules. She ordered what he recommended and told herself she was being adaptable. At the office, he cut her off once during a presentation. She was midway through a proposal when he began speaking over her, restating her point in slightly different words, as if it had just occurred to him. She saw 2 of her colleagues glance at each other. She smiled and let it go, and afterward told herself that was how things worked at this level. You had to earn the right to be heard. A month in, he gave her a gift, a structured handbag in cognac leather, wrapped in tissue inside a signature box. She recognized the brand immediately, the kind of thing she had photographed in store windows on her lunch breaks without ever going inside. You should dress to match the rooms you're walking into, he said, watching her open it. It makes a difference. People notice. She told herself it was thoughtful. She brought the bag home that evening and set it on the bedroom dresser. Daniel was reading in bed, glasses low on his nose, the Financial Times folded across his knee. He looked up, glanced at the bag, and said nothing. From a client, she said. He looked at her for a moment, not accusingly, not suspiciously. Just looked. Then he went back to his page. She told herself that was exactly the problem. He never asked. He never pushed. He simply accepted everything she offered and expected nothing more, which should have felt like freedom, but felt increasingly like being unseen. Richard asked her directly on a Wednesday evening in the back of a car that smelled like leather and cold air. He wanted something real, he said. He was tired of half measures and convenient arrangements. He looked at her the way men look at things they intend to acquire, and she felt in that moment like the most visible she had ever been in her life. She went home that night and stood in the kitchen doorway watching Daniel. He was at the stove, making eggs for dinner, the way he sometimes did when neither of them felt like cooking anything real. He had his back to her. He was wearing an old gray shirt, the kind that had been washed too many times, and he was humming something low and tuneless under his breath. He turned when he heard her come in and said, "Hungry?" She looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something crack open in her chest. Not love or what was left of it. Something older than that, the particular sorrow of a decision that has already been made. "I want a divorce," she said. He turned the burner off. He set the spatula down on the counter with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing his response. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask if she was sure or whether there was someone else or what she thought she would find on the other side of this that she couldn't find here. He signed the papers 11 days later, in a lawyer's office on a Tuesday morning. The room was beige and climate-controlled and smelled faintly of printer ink. Emily sat across from him with her hands folded on the table, watching him read through the documents with the same quiet attention he gave everything methodical, unbothered, as if this too were simply something to be handled correctly. When he finished, he signed. Set the pen down. Then he looked at her across the table with an expression she could not name even later, when she tried not anger, not grief, not the devastation she had braced herself for, and perhaps in some small hidden way had hoped for. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said. That was all. She told herself his composure proved she was right, that a man who could lose his marriage with that much quiet had never truly been present in it, that his calm was evidence of his limitation. She walked out of the lawyer's office and into the flat October sunlight and felt the warm paper in her hands and called it freedom. She didn't think about the suits in the back of the closet. She didn't think about the late-night calls or the journals stacked on the counter or the way he had looked at her when she brought home the handbag and said nothing at all. She didn't think about any of it. She was already looking ahead. The apartment was on the 28th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city like a promise kept. Emily stood at the glass on her first morning there and told herself this was what arriving felt like. For a while it was. Richard moved through her new life with the same authority he moved through everything else, decisive, frictionless, always slightly ahead of whatever room he was in. He took her to restaurants where the menus had no prices on the women's copies. He introduced her to people whose names she recognized from business sections of newspapers. He bought her things without being asked, which she had always imagined would feel like being understood. It felt instead like being furnished. The first sign came so quietly she nearly missed it. They were at a dinner with two of Richard's associates, men in their 50s, with the kind of tans that came from actual leisure, when Emily offered an observation about a project she had been working on. One of the men began to respond. Richard talked over both of them, steering the conversation somewhere else entirely, and afterward, in the car, told her that dinner wasn't the place for shop talk. She said she understood. The second sign came a week later. Richard asked who she had been on the phone with that afternoon. She told him it was an old friend from her previous department. He nodded slowly in the way people nod when they are deciding whether to believe something, and said he preferred she keep her social circle to people they both knew. It made things simpler, he said. She told herself that was just how private people operated. By the end of the second month, she had stopped offering opinions in meetings where Richard was present. She had learned through a series of small and bloodless corrections that her role in those rooms was not to contribute, but to represent, to sit beside him at the right angle, in the right clothes, and reflect well. She was not a person in those spaces. She was context. She thought sometimes late at night when Richard was asleep and the city glittered below her like something that belonged to someone else, about what she had imagined this life would feel like. She had imagined visibility. She had imagined being seen. She had not imagined that being seen and being known were two completely different things. She didn't allow herself to stay in that thought for long. She had made her decision with open eyes, she told herself. She was simply adjusting. The emergency executive meeting was called on a Thursday with less than 18 hours' notice. Emily knew something was different from the moment she stepped off the elevator. The 32nd floor, which normally operated with the studied calm of people who had decided long ago that urgency was beneath them, was moving differently. Assistants walked faster. Conversations stopped when she passed. Richard's door was closed, which was unusual for 9 in the morning. She was admitted to the boardroom in her capacity as senior liaison, taking a seat along the sidewall with the other support staff. The table was full, regional directors' department heads, 2 members of the legal team she had never seen before. Richard sat at the near end, composed in the way a person is composed when they are working at it. The door at the far end of the room opened. A man walked in alone. No assistant, no briefcase, no visible signal of importance beyond the fact that the room rearranged itself around him without anyone saying a word. He was wearing a navy suit, well-cut, quiet, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. He moved to the head of the table and set down a single folder. Richard Hayes stood up. Emily had worked beside this man for months. She had watched him receive senators and close deals worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. She had never once seen him stand for anyone. "Mr. Carter," Richard said, "thank you for making the trip." The man at the head of the table looked up, and Emily Carter stopped breathing. It was Daniel. Her Daniel, except that he wasn't in any way she could now recognize the man she thought she had known. The gray shirt was gone. The reading glasses were gone. The quiet domesticity of him, the eggs on the stove, the tuneless humming, all of it was gone. What remained was something she had always been looking at without ever seeing, a stillness that wasn't passivity, but control. The kind of calm that didn't need the room to be quiet, because it was already quieter than the room. He looked at her once, directly, briefly, without surprise, as if he had known she would be there and had already decided what to do with that fact. Then he opened his folder and began to speak. She learned it all in the next 40 minutes. Daniel Carter was not a regional engineer. He was a principal shareholder and the de facto strategic authority behind Nexus Corp, the kind of ownership that didn't appear in press releases or org charts, the kind that operated several layers above the people who thought they were in charge. Richard Hayes, she understood now with a clarity that felt like cold water, had always been a regional manager operating under a mandate he had never fully understood the source of. The man she had left for being ordinary had the entire time been the reason the extraordinary man above her had a job. She sat against the wall and kept her face still and thought about the suits in the back of the closet, those 3 perfectly cut suits he had dismissed as conference gifts. She thought about the late-night calls on the back porch, the voice that gave instructions and didn't receive them. The way he had said so simply, "We have more than enough," and she had heard evasion when he had been telling her the precise truth. The meeting ended. People filed out with the particular efficiency of those who had just been reminded who they were actually working for. Emily waited until the room had mostly cleared, then crossed to where Daniel was gathering his folder. "Daniel," he looked up. His expression was courteous, professionally warm, exactly the expression you would use with someone you knew slightly and wished well. "Emily," he said, "I hope you've been well." 5 words, perfectly calibrated. She felt them like a door closing. She started to say something, she wasn't sure what. Something true, something that might reach back across the distance she had created. But Richard appeared at her shoulder. Jaw set, eyes moving between the 2 of them with a new and calculating attention. "I wasn't aware you 2 were acquainted," Richard said. Daniel looked at him with the same courteous neutrality. "We know each other," he said, and left it at that. After that morning, things moved quickly and badly. Richard, who had once told her she was wasted in her previous role, now found her skills adequately suited to it. Her access to executive meetings was quietly revoked. The invitations to client dinners stopped. She was reassigned to administrative coordination for a mid-level regional project, not fired, not demoted on paper, simply redirected in the way you redirect water, without drama and without asking its opinion. She understood what was happening. She had become a liability. Whatever Richard had believed about her connections, whatever calculus had made her useful to him, had been rearranged by the sight of Daniel saying her name without explanation. She was no longer an asset. She was a variable he couldn't control, and Richard Hayes did not tolerate variables. She tried once more to reach Daniel. She sent a brief email, professional in tone, asking if he had time for a brief conversation. His assistant replied the following day, "Mr. Carter's schedule was fully committed for the foreseeable future, but she was welcome to submit any work-related concerns through the appropriate channels." She read it 3 times, looking for something to argue with. There was nothing. At home in the apartment, Richard's apartment, she reminded herself now, because her name had never been on the lease. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the cognac leather handbag on the shelf across the room. She had carried it every day for 2 months. She had believed when she received it that it meant she had crossed into a different category of person. She looked at it now and saw only what it was a thing. Expensive, well-made, belonging to a version of herself she was no longer sure she recognized. 3 weeks later, the restructuring was announced company-wide. It was thorough and unapologetic. Daniel Carter assumed his formal role as executive chairman, a title that made visible what had apparently always been true. 2 regional directorships were dissolved. Richard Hayes was reassigned to a newly created advisory position, the kind of role that had a title and no actual authority, the kind that sophisticated organizations invented when they needed to move someone sideways without the optics of removing them. Emily read the announcement on her work computer in her reassigned office on the 14th floor, which had 1 window and looked out at the parking structure. She thought about the first night Richard had taken her to dinner, the way the room had rearranged itself around him, the way she had watched and thought this is what power looks like. She understood now that she hadn't been watching power. She had been watching performance, and she had been so hungry for what it represented, the visibility, the arrival, the proof that she had finally crossed the invisible line she had been pressing herself against since childhood, that she had not thought to ask what was holding it up. Richard had been holding up a structure that Daniel owned, and she had left Daniel to get closer to the structure. She sat in her 14th floor office with its view of the parking structure and did not cry. She was not, she realized, in a place where crying was the right response. She was in a place that required something harder than that, the willingness to look at what she had done without flinching, without excuse, without the comfortable story that she had simply been deceived. She had not been deceived. She had been exactly as perceptive as she chose to be. That was the thing she could not find a way around. She gave herself 2 weeks, 2 weeks to sit with it, not to grieve, not to plan, just to let the full weight of what she had done settle into her without flinching away from it. She moved out of Richard's apartment on a Saturday morning, packing what was hers into 4 bags, and leaving the cognac leather handbag on the shelf where she had found it. It wasn't hers. It had never been hers. It had been a costume she had mistaken for a life. She rented a room in a furnished apartment in Midtown, small, clean, anonymous, the kind of place that made no promises. She went to work each day on the 14th floor and did her job and spoke to her colleagues and did not explain herself to anyone, because there was nothing to explain that the 14th floor window didn't already say clearly enough. At night, she lay in the rented room and did what she had been avoiding for months, she remembered. Not Richard. She found somewhat to her surprise that Richard occupied very little space in her memory now that she had stopped needing him to mean something. He had been a surface she had projected onto. Without the projection, he was simply a man who had treated her as a convenience and then discarded her when she became complicated. There was nothing to mourn in that. What she remembered was Daniel. She remembered the way he had looked at her across the lawyer's table, not with anger, not with the wounded devastation she had braced herself for, but with something quieter and more permanent than either. She remembered the night she had told him about Fresno, and the way he had put his hand over hers without saying a word, and how she had wanted more from that gesture than it seemed able to give. She understood now what he had actually been offering. The willingness to hold something without needing to fix it. She had handed it back to him unopened. She understood something now that she could not have understood before, because understanding it required losing it. First, Daniel had never been invisible. She had made him invisible. She had needed him to be ordinary, so that her leaving would feel like ambition rather than what it actually was, fear. The old fear, the one from Fresno, the one that had pressed its face against other people's windows and told itself that wanting more was the same thing as deserving better. She had confused a hunger with a compass, and she had followed it straight off the edge of the only solid ground she'd ever had. She went to his office on a Thursday morning without calling ahead. The building was in the financial district, glass, and steel 40 stories, the kind of address that appeared on contracts rather than conversations. She gave her name at the front desk and said she was there to see Daniel Carter, and the receptionist asked if she had an appointment, and she said no. And the receptionist made a brief phone call and then told her that Mr. Carter had a few minutes between 9:30 and 10, and she was welcome to go up. She had not expected that. The elevator rose smoothly, and she watched the floors climb and thought about what she intended to say. She had not prepared a speech. She had decided, somewhere in the 2 weeks of sitting with it, that prepared speeches were for people who still needed the outcome to go a certain way. She didn't need it to go any particular way. She needed to say true things out loud to the person they were owed to. His office was on the 38th floor, larger than Richard's. The windows faced south and west, and the morning light came in broad, and even across a desk that was clean except for a single open folder and a copy of the Financial Times folded to the second page. She noticed that detail and felt something tighten briefly in her chest. Daniel was standing when she entered. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, and they both sat, and the city spread behind him like a backdrop he had never bothered to notice. "Thank you for seeing me," Emily said. "Of course," he said, and then waited without filling the space, without making it easier or harder. Just waited in the way she now recognized as entirely characteristic of him, the willingness to let things arrive at their own pace. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked at him. "I'm not here to ask for anything," she said. "I want you to know that first. I'm not here to ask you to reconsider, or to explain yourself, or to give me anything at all. I needed to say some things, and you're the only person they belong to." He nodded once, still waiting. She told him about Fresno again, not the brief version she had given him, that one night early in their marriage, but the real one, about the damp carpet and the humming refrigerator and her mother's chalk-white fingers, about pressing her face against other people's windows on evening walks, and the particular shame of wanting a life that didn't look like the one you'd been given. She told him that she had carried that shame into everything, into the scholarship, into the job, into their marriage, and that she had never once let herself examine it, because examining it would have meant admitting that she still lived inside it. She told him that when Richard had looked at her like she was worth looking at, what she had felt wasn't love or even attraction. It was relief. The relief of believing for the first time that she had finally crossed the line. "I told myself you were ordinary," she said. "I needed you to be ordinary, because if you were ordinary, and I still wanted to leave then, leaving was ambition. But if you were something else," she stopped, collected herself. "If you were something else, then what I did was just fear wearing a better outfit." Daniel's expression hadn't changed. He was watching her with the same careful, unhurried attention. He had always given everything the same attention she had spent years interpreting as absence. She continued. "I didn't know what you were. That's true. But I also never asked. I never asked because knowing would have made it harder to leave, and I had already decided to leave before I had any honest reason to, and I think some part of me knew that even then. On some level I knew." The room was very quiet. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she said. "I don't think forgiveness is what this is about. I just needed you to know that I see it clearly now. What I did, what I threw away, I see it, and I'm not going to spend the rest of my life dressing it up as something it wasn't." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was the same as it had always been, low and unhurried, and entirely without performance. I knew where you came from, Emily. I always knew. He looked toward the window briefly, then back. I knew about Fresno. I knew about your mother. I knew that the hunger you carried was older than us, older than anything I could have addressed by being a better husband. Because it wasn't about me. It was never really about me. Emily felt the truth of that land in her chest, like something she had been holding at a distance, finally being allowed to arrive. Daniel went on. I thought that if I gave you enough stability, enough time, you would eventually feel safe enough to stop running. I thought love could do. That could hold still long enough for someone to catch up to it. He looked at her directly. I was wrong about that. Not about you. About what love is able to fix on its own. Daniel, I forgave you, he said simply. A long time ago. That part was never the question. He leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the desk, and she recognized the gesture from 1,000 ordinary evenings, the same way he had leaned forward over the kitchen table, over a book, over whatever he was giving his full attention to. The question is what comes next, for both of us separately. She understood what he meant. She had understood it before she walked in. But hearing it said aloud, without cruelty and without apology, made it real in a way that her own private understanding hadn't quite managed. You're not coming back, she said. No, he said. I'm not. He said it gently. Not as a punishment, as a fact. The kind of fact that had been true for long enough that it no longer required any emotion to deliver. She nodded. She had prepared herself for this. She found, sitting here in the broad morning light of his 38th floor office, with the city laid out behind him, that she was all right. Not happy, not yet. Maybe not for a long time, but all right. There was a difference between grief and devastation, she was learning. Grief was clean. Devastation needed someone to blame. She was done with blame. I hope you're well, she said, standing. I mean that. I genuinely mean that. He stood also in the way he always had automatically, without thinking, the reflex of a man who had been raised to stand when someone rose. She remembered suddenly that she had found that quality faintly old-fashioned once. She looked at it now and saw it for what it was, a man who had been taught that other people deserved a certain quality of attention, that it cost nothing to show up correctly in small moments. She had spent years cataloging what he wasn't. She had never made a list of what he was. They shook hands at the door. His grip was the same as it had always been, firm, brief, without residual feeling either way. The door closed behind her, and she stood for a moment in the corridor, her hand still faintly warm from the contact, and then she walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. She drove to Fresno that weekend. Her mother was in the kitchen when she arrived, smaller than Emily remembered, or perhaps Emily was simply seeing her more accurately now, without the layer of childhood shame that had always distorted the view. The kitchen smelled like coffee and dish soap. The refrigerator still hummed too loud. Her mother turned from the counter and said, "You look thin," because that was what her mother always said. And Emily sat down at the kitchen table and said, "I know, Mom." And her mother poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her, and neither of them said anything important. For a while. That was all right. Emily had learned. Lately, that silence wasn't absence. It was just space, the kind that didn't need filling to mean something. She stayed the weekend. She helped her mother recaulk the bathroom. She slept in her childhood bedroom under a quilt that was older than some of her professional relationships. She lay in the dark on Saturday night and listened to the neighborhood sprinklers, a dog somewhere, the particular quiet of a street where people went to bed early, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could measure, that she was in the right place. Not the place she had always wanted. The place she had always been from. She understood now that those were not the same thing as failure. Daniel Carter became the kind of person that people in those industries described as a quiet force, the executive chairman, whose name appeared rarely in trade publications, whose preferences were not widely known, whose power expressed itself not in press releases, but in outcomes. He still read the Financial Times in the mornings. He still wore suits that didn't need to announce themselves. He was, by every account that reached Emily, in the years that followed, exactly who he had always been. He had simply stopped pretending to be less. Emily did not return to Nexus Corp after her resignation, which she submitted on a Tuesday, the same day of the week she noticed as the divorce papers. She took a position at a smaller company in Sacramento, modest office, reasonable hours, work that asked for her actual judgment and received it without redirection. She was not invisible there. She had learned finally the difference between being seen by someone else and being known to yourself. One of them depended on the room you were standing in, the other one you carried. She carried it from Fresno. She would carry it wherever she went next. That she had decided was enough, more than enough. The real value of a person is not in what they put on display, but in what they never needed to display at all. And sometimes the most expensive lesson of a life is not losing money or status or standing. Sometimes it is looking back and understanding that the thing you walked away from was the very thing you spent your whole life trying to find.